Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Carrier Cloud Transformation, Profitability, Challenges, and Strategies, presented by Nokia. In today's webinar, the presenters will share what they have learned through research and practical day-to-day experience in working with wireless operators on telco cloud deployments. The format on today's webinar will be a little different from what I normally do here. As each presenter presents their relevant slides, they will also have an interactive discussion. Let's begin with introductions. First up, we will have Dana Cooperson, Research Director at Analysys Mason. She will cover the market overview and share research recently completed on the status of Telco Cloud. Next, we will have Sami Pekala, Telco Cloud Chief Architect at Nokia. He will represent the Nokia North American customer experience. And then finally, we will have Peter Knickink, Head of Service Product Management for Telco Cloud at Nokia. He will represent the Nokia Global Experiences and Vendor Solutions perspective. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dana with Analysys Mason to get started. Dana?
Great. Thank you very much, Kyle. Appreciate the introduction. First, I thought I would start with a little bit about Nokia and Analysys Mason and our collaboration. We've been working together for the past couple of years on Telco Cloud, and we realized that there was really no third-party assessment out there by which different communication service providers could just know where they are in relation to each other, and really in terms of the overall goal of becoming true digital service providers, which is really what most of the communication service providers we talk to are really looking forward to becoming. So we started a collaboration, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue with today's webcast. So as Kyle mentioned, we're going to be discussing the current status of carrier cloud transformation, and I thought I would take just a second here to note that what Nokia calls telco cloud deployments, or what Analysys Mason refers to as software-controlled networks, or SCNs, but we're really talking about the same thing. So we're going to look across the globe, and I believe Sami will provide some interest what's going on in the U.S. specifically. So we'll look at the current status of the deployments and what the challenges are that the operators face as they try to migrate and deploy this new technology. And then we'll address the role of vendors and systems integrators and how they can help advance operator strategies as they move forward and close the gaps in execution planning. So first, let's talk about some of the most recent findings from our research. If you could please advance. Next slide. Okay, so what I'm showing on here is that if you kind of take a step back, and software-controlled networks are really what we see as the sixth wave of some very major changes in networking, in telecommunications, starting about 50 or so years ago with the move to from analog to digital, and then moving through a bunch of other things, copper to fiber, and so on. What we're really looking at is the next biggest transition here. And the reason that we want to make this transition, we don't want to just do this for fun, is that in order for communication service providers to become digital service providers, so providers whereby communications remains at the heart of their service offerings, but they can layer many, many more things on top of those communication lines and provide much more innovative, dynamic, personalized services, you really need to think differently and act differently, and in fact have very different networks. So the trends behind this transition are, of course, anywhere, anytime communications that's just becoming more and more a fact of life, moving towards real-time automated service fulfillment and experience management, excuse me, and ultimately to provide services that are based on delivery over cloud as opposed to something that's a lot less flexible. And finally, service providers really need to be able to innovate much more quickly and much more flexibly with new services, and in fact bring in some third-party application providers as well to ride on top of their network. Virtualization is really critical to this effort to become digital service providers. From an efficiency perspective, it allows elastic capacity to be brought into play whenever it's necessary. You can employ services and resource orchestration with an underlying policy, security, and analytics so that you can do stuff in real time and make those updates. And what we're really talking about is a bridging of the IT and the communication worlds, which have largely been separate up to now. And then finally, in order to bring in those third parties, you need an automated structure, and you need to be able to provide an API-driven architecture to let those third parties in. So all these things are part of this move to the telco cloud or the software-controlled networks. So if we move on to the next slide, we can see our most recent forecast, which was just released a few weeks ago, and to show you what the outlook is for this technology in terms of the spending. So I'm showing 3 different charts on this slide. On the upper left, you can see the breakdown between NFV, SDN, and cloud computing. We look at all 3 of those things as part of software-controlled networks. And as you can see from that chart, cloud computing is by far today the biggest of the 3 markets, and that's because the service providers have been for quite a long time now upgrading their IT infrastructure, their data centers, in order to be more flexible and to make the move to cloud. NFV and SDN, however, are much smaller markets, but of course we expect them to grow very, very quickly, and that's why they're up and to the left on that chart. In terms of the total market, we're looking at about a tripling of the spending from right now, the bulk of it being in the cloud computing, as I mentioned, in about $6 billion total, to about tripling to over about $19 billion, over $18 billion by the end of our forecast period in 2019. And in terms of where the spending will happen, we've broken it down there for you in the middle of the slide by region, and you can see with the color coding where the higher and lower growth regions are. So we see North America spending increasing to about $6.4 billion. And the spend there is mostly on cloud computing and SDN, and that's because of intense competition with some of the over-the-top providers, the so-called over-the-top providers, as well as between the communication service providers themselves. Next up is EMEA, and about $6.2 billion at the end of our forecast period. And there, NFE is the primary driver, and it's the tier ones who are spending the money there, so in Western Europe particularly. In Asia Pac, a little bit smaller, about $5.4 billion by the end of the forecast period, and that's because of just some slowdowns we're seeing currently in China. It'll take a little bit longer to make that ramp up, but there, as in Europe, we're talking about the major service providers being the drivers, the China Mobiles, the NTTs, the Korea Telecoms, Telstras, and so on. And then finally, Latin America, as always, is a little bit further behind and much smaller. And there, most of what we're seeing is folks like Telefonica who are doing software-controlled networks from their headquarters, in that case back in Spain, but doing a lot of the implementations, the first implementations in Latin America. So North America is the biggest of the regional markets there. And if we move on to the next slide, how do we break this down further? I mentioned we've got the NFV, SDN cloud computing breakdown, but we also look at the market by hardware, software services, and then further into submarkets. And I'm not even showing on this slide, we further break down the software OSS management into subsegments, for example, of service fulfillment, service assurance, and other management, which includes network orchestration and NFV management. Okay, but what we're looking at here on the right-hand side is specifically that breakdown between hardware, software, and services. And we want to point out that even though a lot of the focus is about software control and about moving to the networks being much more software oriented, there is a lot of hardware still required. And in fact, because of the kind of move that we're making, the servers and the storage that will be required will actually have a fairly substantial growth. So sometimes that's the part that people don't think about, but we are looking at a lot of growth in hardware spurred by people like Intel and ARM, for example, at the semiconductor level. We will expect, though, of course, a lot of software, and that's where the real focus here is on moving to SDN and NFV control. But the third segment, which often is also neglected, is very important here, and that's the professional services segment. And we're showing that, we believe, to grow to almost an $8 billion market by the end of our forecast period. And what's going on there is we're going to see a transition from just pure data center modernization and some very early NFV SDN commercial trials at the service providers to something that's much, much more substantial, and where we believe the CSPs will be looking for quite a bit of help from suppliers, both vendors and systems integrators, to help develop, implement, integrate, test, support, and upgrade all that hardware and software that they're going to be purchasing and putting into the network as part of multi-year next generation virtual network transformations. So yes, we want to make these solutions as off the shelf as possible and not have to have them be customizable, but it's very hard to do that in the beginning, especially because we're in the very early stages of this market. And we do believe that CSPs will be looking for lots of help, and particularly, as we'll see in a minute, to get physical and virtual elements to coexist, to integrate multi-vendor solutions, and ultimately to transform the networks in their businesses. And we'll talk a lot more about what kinds of services will be available later on in this webcast when Peter takes the lead. Okay, can we turn to the next slide, please? So what I'm going to show here and in the next slide are some driving factors and where people are with making this transition, and why maybe you can't just snap a finger and get from here where we are to where we want to be in a year or two. We're really talking about a decades-long process of transformation here. So what I'm showing on the left-hand side of this slide is some of the drivers and the inhibitors in terms of what are short and long-term as people look to put this new technology to work in their networks. So often the first focus is on cost optimization, and certainly we're seeing a little bit of that. That's some of the earliest benefits that can be provided to service providers if you take a purpose-built box and replace it, for example, with something that's not purpose-built. But longer term, the real benefits of this new technology are really going to show themselves in terms of service agility and new digital services that can ride on top of this new platform that each service provider will build. So that's really the ultimate driver, and we're certainly, over the past year when we did our first forecast versus this last one that I just mentioned, we've really seen the service provider thinking change to be looking more at those longer term benefits. As you know, of course, also reaping some of the short-term benefits, but in terms of it's looking long-term. But of course, as usual, there are some inhibitors here to get past. And the first thing, of course, is that because this is a very new market, a lot of the products and solutions are not that mature yet. So getting to that commercial off-the-shelf where one size fits all is going to take us quite some time. The second thing is that when one invests in lots of expensive hardware and software, you don't want to just throw it away and go with something new. You really do have to get the benefits of that investment, and so there's going to be prioritization and a balance in bringing in the new and using the old. And finally, it's the uncertain business benefit. And because it takes some time, we're finding even internally within the service providers to make sure that they understand and what the business case is, what's that business case all about, and moving to this new technology and the new way of running the business. If we transition to the right-hand side of the slide, we're looking at the different deployment strategies, and what we're seeing mostly today is what we would call a service-led strategy, and that's because it's much, much easier to ascertain what the business benefits are. If you provide a business case based on providing a new service, for example, virtual CPE-based new service for Ethernet services for business or VPN services for business, that's a much more easy business case to make than something that says, I want to transform my entire network. So those uncertain business benefits in the future, we're going to be tackling them over time, but it's much easier, as I said, to go with a service-led strategy today. The second type of strategy we're starting to see a bit is called a lifecycle upgrade. That's kind of more of a cap and grow strategy. So whereas in the first one we're seeing people like KT, Vodafone Germany launch virtual IMS to provide VoLTE services, and I mentioned virtual CPE, AT&T's Network on Demand, and Deutsche Telekom's Cloud VPN services, very, very defined services. What we're seeing in the second case of lifecycle services is more things like, you know what, my HLR is at the end of its life, let me just go with a virtual one, or my telecom app server is at the end of its life, let me just move to a virtualization type of platform, PCRF, those kinds of things is what we're seeing in the middle. But then ultimately we think in order to not get into this silo-based situation whereby you're adding a service, you're adding basically a vertical silo to support that service, you're adding another service and so on, that ultimately the telecom companies need to take more of a platform migration strategy, more like IT companies are used to doing. And that is you find an architecture for a scalable virtualization platform based on a reference architecture, and then migrate over time different infrastructure, VNFs, and services onto that platform. So the migration would be triggered by a combination of infrastructure and server investments, as in the first two categories, but it avoids that past practice of creating silos. And a couple examples there we're seeing is Telefonica with its Unica architecture, and AT&T with its universal services platform, moving all of its voice services onto a single platform. Okay, so how mature are the service providers? Let's move on to the next two slides. We'll see this slide is showing making software-controlled networks a reality and reaping the benefits. We look at 4 different signs of maturity when we try to assess objectively where service providers are in this process. The first one is, do they have a master plan? Do they know where they're going? They may have to make some tweaks, obviously, along the way, and they should. They have to be flexible, but they really need to know what the end goal is. And as part of that is, how engaged is that CXO suite here, and perhaps even the board of directors in this change. The second thing is, can they say, yes, I have budget secured, and is it one of the top, say, 3 to 5 budget priorities in the company? The third is, what's the transformation being driven by? Is it being driven by business goals and priorities as opposed to something else like technology goals? And then finally, we look as a company that's been focused on software research for many years. We look at, where's the OSS BSS in this? Are these transformations that the company's making going to be manageable? How will they manage hybrid networks? Because they're going to be with us a long time. The next slide shows a little bit more what we look at as the path for that transformation to a much more mature approach to the technology and the business that goes beyond the technology. And we're showing 3 different steps here, or phases. The first we would call a readiness phase, and that is, I mentioned PCRF. Perhaps somebody starts by taking a PCRF and saying, we're going to go with a virtual type of PCRF. Well, that would be considered a readiness phase because they're deploying virtual elements, but they may not have done anything with it in terms of the second phase, which is adoption of the technology much more in a widespread way to create a virtual next generation network, and to have that physical and virtual elements coexist in a network and be manageable. And then finally, to get to a true mature phase of this transformation, that's going to take quite a long time to become that real digital service provider. And if we look at the service providers that we speak to, we see that most of them are in that readiness phase, or they're just waiting on the sidelines. Some of the smaller ones are just kind of waiting to see what happens. But the ones that are active are really in the readiness phase, with a few moving into adoption, and essentially nobody is in that mature phase. It just hasn't been long enough for us to get there. The other thing is, I'm showing this as a straight path between these 3 phases, but of course it's not going to be a straight path at all. Every operator will have to take, every operator has a different starting point, and therefore will have to take a different path, and they will have different business goals as well. So on that path to becoming a digital service provider, there's no one size that fits all. It's really important for service providers to have a realistic picture of their starting point as benchmarked against what we consider to be an objective scenario of technology maturity versus business maturity, but also against their competitors. And that's why Nokia and Analysys Mason started to work together to develop the Telco Cloud Index, and that's exactly what we seek to do, is to benchmark individual carriers as they make this this journey to becoming true digital service providers. Peter, did you want to jump in here and share anything with the audience about how we're working together?
Absolutely, absolutely. I will elaborate a bit more on this later on the Telco Cloud Index. But essentially, we were seeing over the last years with our experience in the market different approaches, and but we wanted to bring those approaches into a framework so that we could evaluate the operator transition to the cloud. And then for this, we teamed up with Analysys Mason the end of last year, and we jointly defined the framework, and we have run the first successful tries during February. And now we're expanding that to include more operators and additional geographies. But I will touch on this later in the presentation in more detail on the TCI. Back to you, Dana.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, if we could move on to the next slide then, please. So I mentioned before that this is a very difficult transition. It's very challenging, but you wouldn't do it unless there weren't a reason for it, and that is because of the opportunities for new services at the end of the rainbow here. And what I'm showing on this slide is just a little bit more about the kinds of services we're seeing vendors such as Nokia and others provide to their service provider customers, their CSP customers. And we're also seeing CSPs want and challenging their suppliers to move beyond just kind of the main, garden variety, commodity, resource-intensive services to try and save cost to something that's much more transformational and ultimately much more innovative. So something that's much more revenue-focused and service-oriented. And things like, as I'm showing on the right-hand side, that hybrid physical virtual coexistence, multi-vendor integration, which is where we think most of the services spending in SCNs will take place, but also ultimately into making true transformations of the business and of the network. And that's how we break down that $8 billion we see that'll be spent in 2019. So a lot of it, those first two categories are really systems integration categories. Sammy or Peter, did you want to make any other comments here at this point?
Yeah, Dana, so while you have been working with the CSPs, and what is your view? Has there been any shift in the CSPs from different categories to another one? And what do you think about the future in this sense?
Yeah, well, we're definitely seeing a lot of the services activity of the service providers, or I should say their desire for help is pretty much across the boards, from just consulting on business and technology all the way through a lot of focus on systems integration is where we, as I mentioned, is where we think this is going to go. So we do see service providers recognizing that they need to become bolder and they need to be focused more on the top line and that new service creation and be willing to partner to help get to that innovative place that they want to be. And they need partners that can believe and help them get where they want to be. And where they want to be ultimately is in a very big multi-vendor solution with open and standard offerings, and not to be locked in, of course. That's really important to them. So they are looking for partners that can help them realize what they want to do and get there as quickly as possible. And then I would like to just close off my section of the talk today with the final slide, just to summarize, to say that our forecast looks at about a tripling of spending in this area by communications service providers on a combination of cloud computing, NFV, and SDN, with NFV was the one that's going to be growing the biggest and the strongest here. And that does, by the way, include, when we look at NFV, that includes both software, hardware, and services. Okay, and the same thing with cloud computing and SDN. I know somebody had asked a question about that in the chat window. And the SDM journey really, though, has just begun. The service providers really haven't had time to progress very far along the maturity curve that I talked about. And what are they doing? Well, they're doing still a lot of POCs and a lot of first office applications, a lot of service launches in some cases, and they're really weighing the business benefits and the risks here, and they're seeking help and guidance in the form of professional services, and a trusted partner that can help with the transition while they're reviewing deployment strategies. And what they're doing in terms of the experience gathering is moving from the service-led deployments where they can get that experience, where they can start with something that's fairly low risk and high reward in terms of new services, and then get to something much more elaborate that they can justify financially as they gain that experience. Now, thank you very much, and now I'd like to hand it over to Peter.
Okay, thank you very much, Dana. If you could, next slide, indeed, this one. Yeah, thanks very much. I think very interesting facts you shared with us, and definitely I think from our side, many of the experiences that you brought up out of the market, this is what we see as well. And we very much believe that systems integration will play a key role, as the industry evolves towards virtually and software-defined networks. So let me start with giving an overview, on how we are addressing these topics. I think one of the, the key notions that you already made is no one size fits all. It needs a tailored approach to address the specific challenges. And I think that this picture here on this slide illustrates exactly some of the points you made. That every operator will have its own priorities, will have its own different challenges, and there's no single option that will fit every carrier's needs. So there are many influencing factors operators need to consider and have a clear plan for. Some of them already mentioned, but we'd like to zone in into a couple in more detail. Let's go to the next slide, please. So with every solution being unique, it introduces a new kind of complexity. Firstly, incorporating the flexibility of cloud technologies, whilst at the same time, addressing and adhering to specific requirements of telco applications. And secondly, we have to shift from telco resources to the cloud that can help operators cope with the unpredictable data growth by creating large pools of resources that can eventually then be deployed to support the distributed network as needed. Then another key topic is the adoption of centralized and standardized infrastructure. This enables operators to deploy a high level of automation and network operations. It also makes it easier then to develop new applications and services that can run on the resulting platform in a standardized way. The automation and standardization will drastically reduce cost, and it will probably be the key driver for operators when they initially consider adopting the cloud approach. However, it's also a key enabler for business agility, and this will become increasingly important driver. So this agility, this would pave the way of working that can massively speed up service development and deployment. In addition, as well, by lowering the cost of new services, turning out to be a failure, coupled with a reduced risk of failure in the first place, this would make innovation far more attractive. So from a North American perspective, Sami, based on your experience in the North American market, could you please elaborate on the complexity of implementing telco cloud?
Thank you, Peter. So yeah, so basically, as you can understand, deploying a new platform is complex enough, but even with our discussion with the operators, now they have been proceeding with their project and plannings, and they have found it even more complex because of thinking about how to operate the network after the initial deployment. I understand that they are running the network in a hybrid mode for quite some time, and they have the legacy and telco cloud applications in there at the same time in parallel. So with that, we have been spending a great deal of time with the operators to figure out how to operate and orchestrate the network in a hybrid mode during the lifecycle and elasticity management. And we have been implementing some features and functionalities into our orchestration solution to help in that manner. Thank you. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Sami. So I think fully agree with your assessment. And we go to the next slide. And as well, based on all the discussions we had with operators, as I said, there's many challenges and many questions that are open. And I think based on our experiences, I think we grouped them into 4 key questions. How do I transform my network? What kind of benefits do I get out of this transformation? What are the functionalities and technologies to use? And what should be my overall strategy for this transformation? So I think this was the baseline as well to build then our service offering to address those 4 questions. If you could go to the next slide. But in order to answer these questions, I think it was already mentioned by Dana before, is that there's no one size that fits all, and every operator will have its own starting point and own area that they want to achieve and where they want to go to. But what we did on a high level here as well, then grouped this transformation journey into the 4 different steps. So firstly, selecting the right transformation strategy, then building the associated business case with that, then assessing the requirements on the technology, skills and processes available in the company, and then finally looking at how can we implement this. So this was the basis then as well to develop our overall service offering. And if you could go to the next slide, please. So here, you can see how this approach translates into a full set of services to support the cloud transformation, and then providing a complete life cycle from technology and business consulting to specific design and implementations, and towards operations as well. So we are constantly updating and evolving these services to bring the benefits of the technology advances into our portfolio, and as well be able to address the fast-changing business landscape and the different business model requirements. So for this, we would like to give you some examples. So firstly, I would like to come back to the Telco Cloud Index. Dana already introduced beginning of the call. Next slide, please. So with regards to the Telco Cloud Index, we began asking ourselves, the question, how do we, as Nokia, as a vendor, help operators to get an objective view of where they're going into the Telco Cloud? How can we help them navigate through the Telco Cloud to achieve their end objectives? The answer that we came up with was thinking of building a leading benchmarking index which would help operators to pitch themselves against their peers and understand where they are in the marketplace. So we started defining this methodology based on a survey, because given the fact that most of our customer teams are already converging with most operators. So we built this framework to position this to operators in a matrix around the business and technology advancements. To assure objectivity based on the operator needs, and as well to further develop this framework and methodology, we partnered with Analysys Mason. Analysys Mason used the interview format, and they brought in the industry expertise and analytic capability to further enrich the process and the outcome. So initially, we defined the target group of a handful of operators in Europe as a pilot, and I think we finalized that successfully with very good feedback from operators then, but I'll come back to that. But as well, now we're extending that to bring in more operators as well across the different geographies. So if we go to the next slide. So briefly looking into the methodology. So based on first step, so we used, as mentioned, the survey-based approach through a guided customer interview with multiple stakeholders from the operators. In this survey, we looked at three key areas. Firstly, the overall strategy to understand the approach to Telco Cloud. By doing so as well, this gave us a very good insight into what are the key drivers and investments around the Telco Cloud. Then secondly, looking at the technology maturity, cover the angle in terms of what our operators are looking for on the technology side, covering the design and deployment needs, culminating in a technology roadmap. Then thirdly, the business maturity, so covering the people, process, and other organizational readiness and larger scope of the transformation. So the second step then, after we've done the first, we started with consolidating the different results by tier, market, and region to understand the position in the Telco Cloud and the transformation path that they have set for themselves. Once we've done that, we create a report on the insights and trends from the interviews, and also what implications they hold for the operator as assessed by Analysys Mason. So as a last step, then providing the feedback results to the customer, explaining their individual implications for their and the markets they are in. Of course, we have done this on an anonymous basis, so the operators can then see themselves compared to the competitors as set in their own geography, but as well, how other geographies are tackling this. And then we are planning to repeat this at regular intervals. So Dana, based on I think the first experiences we had from the pilot, and I think then afterwards. So from your view, what has been the feedback from the customer?
Well, yeah, Peter, it's very interesting because sometimes when we're looking to recruit, people might say, "Oh, we're too busy," because it takes, depending on how many people we interview, it could take an hour and a half to 2 hours. People say, "Ah, we're too busy." But what they found is if they actually do participate, that personalized report that you mentioned, when we send that back to them, they really value that feedback because they do get an objective third-party assessment, and they found that it's very helpful because they're usually involved in internal strategic discussions, and this provides a really, really helpful input to those discussions. And I should mention that even though we're working together in terms of the interviews and in terms of the assessment of the interviews, where we place the various carriers versus other carriers, and just objectively, Nokia is not involved in that part of it. So it really is an objective assessment of the various carriers, and they really do value that assessment. So back to you, Peter.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is, I think, an overview how our telco cloud came into being, so a methodology and framework to benchmark and index the customers based on their position and ambitions. So I think for the next part, I would like to hand over to Sami. He will run through the cloud verification service and partner certification service we have. So please, if you go to the next slide, and over to you, Sami.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, the most critical factor in the rapidly evolving telco cloud environment is the reliable performance of the application on the cloud. And to verify the performance and reduce the technical and business risks during the deployment, we have developed a Nokia Cloud Verification Service. And this service tests and compares the operator's hardware and software environment against a reference cloud implementation through specific testing templates, and we have a unique set of KPIs which will ensure the quality, performance, and resilience of the service. This will also enable operators to optimize their telco cloud performance and capacity by providing really detailed level information about the infrastructure itself and the VNFs on top of the infrastructure. And using the highly automated processes and tooling, this service will speed up the testing of the operator infrastructure in conjunction with the telco application significantly, comparing to traditional functional resilience and performance testing. And as this verification solution is focusing on deployment projects in operator network, we also have developed a certification process to pre-integrate and verify the cloud applications on the cloud infrastructure before delivering the solutions to operators' networks. And a little bit more about that service in the next slide. So here you can see more information about the Nokia Telco Cloud certification process, which ensures the carrier-grade availability and resilience to be achieved for the telco cloud applications prior to deployment to operators' network. And this would allow us to create a telco cloud application ecosystem with fully integrated and verified applications. And our telco cloud certification use case focuses on reducing the complexity of the integrating partner applications, and it also improves the end-to-end solution readiness in preparation for the operator projects before proceeding to the operator network deployment. The scope of this certification is to cover the HCNFV and architectural framework. And this process really benefits our partners and customers with the assurance that the cloud application will use a common hardware infrastructure in the most efficient way, ensure good resource allocation between different virtual network functions, provide a common operations concept, work well with the management and orchestration software layer, implement the customer feature requests, and integrate any change requirement easily. And in addition to this, the certification process provides business benefits by ensuring the smooth deployment of the solution into the platform, offers a complete end-to-end integration with all Nokia virtual network functions, as well as enabling operators to build a customized ecosystem using end-to-end integrated application cells that can easily be scaled on the telco cloud platform.
So, Sami, if I could just break in here one moment, and we see a lot of vendors offering services, professional services of this type. So, what makes Nokia different here?
So, I think one of the main differences we have here is that we have divided this service into the 4 different levels, starting with the very basic application integration on our telco cloud platform to ensure the common hardware usage efficiency. And then the second level would be to automate the deployment by using, for example, the predefined templates. The third level after that would be to integrate the application with our VNF management solution for the lifecycle elasticity management. And naturally after that, the fourth one would be the fully automated network deployment, including the orchestration. And all of these four levels do not need to be completed before proceeding to the live network deployment, because after the first phase, we can already ensure that the application behaves well in this common platform. And then we can proceed in the lab verification further during the deployment project procedure and ensure that everything is verified before we go to the next step in the live network. Would that answer your question, Dana?
Sure. Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate that.
And with that, I would turn this back to Peter.
Okay. Thank you, Sami. If you go to the next slide, please. So I think another topic is that what we see is the transition to the cloud will consist of many phases where operators will have a hybrid environment running both the legacy networks as well as introducing step-by-step cloud. To ensure a smooth transition and migration of the services from a bare metal environment to a cloud environment, a careful migration path and planning is needed. For this to ensure a cost efficiency and as well adherence to milestones and deadlines, and then minimize the service interruptions, both planned as well as the unplanned. So for this, I think we assumed and considered a couple of key topics. Firstly, having a methodology in place. So the migration methodology defines the underlying migration processes and tools for all activities during the migration phase, from the first analysis and project definitions to the migration of the last end user on network service. Providing a full project managed migration path from the start to the finish. Secondly, around technology. In order to complete the transition of, for instance, R4 or EPC on IMS, telco service, from the existing network platform to the new telco target platform, to ensure a smooth and transition, specific technical procedures are required for the correct mapping of the inventory data from source to target. And application data and traffic routing configuration changes might be required. The migration process needs to be adapted to the specific requirements of the customer, as well as the various software tools for monitoring and supporting this migration. Then other point is the operation during migration. So close cooperation with the customer's personnel during the integration of the new equipment, as well as during the migration phase and the introduction of the new processes. By means of training on the job period, a smooth handover to the operational personnel is ensured. Let's go to the next slide, please. So hopefully we have been able to provide you an insight on how we as Nokia are continuously developing and adapting our solutions and services as a prime integrator to enable our customers to be in a pole position for the, I think, ever-evolving future. So with that, I would like to hand back to Vern for the Q&A.
Okay, thanks guys, and we have received a couple of questions, so let me go ahead and cut right to it now that we've got a couple of minutes left over. So Sami, let me give the first one to you if I may, and the question is, do you see service providers trending towards a particular virtualization layer, KVM, VMware, etc.?
That's a really good question, Vern. I think in high level, if we look at what is going on in the marketplace right now globally, that the operators who have made the decision earlier, like a year or 2 years ago, seems to be trending towards the VMware solution. But the operators who are just entering now and making the decision now seems to be favoring OpenStack. That would I say in general.
Okay, thank you. And let me stay with you if I may, please. You talked about the telco cloud application certification process. And could you talk about how that's applied or to whom that's applied, MVNOs or over-the-top service providers, things like that?
I think the certification process is more towards the applications on top of the telco cloud. So whoever does have an application, is it an operator or is it an application provider, could contact us and talk to us about the opportunity to have their application certified on our telco cloud infrastructure.
Okay, thank you for that. And Peter, how about one for you as well, please? Could you give us some examples of some of the new leading digital services that may drive a business case to telco cloud?
So I think the starting, I think it was mentioned by Dana, 2 years ago. I think very much we started the first POC around, IMS, around VoLTE. I think that's some of the key services where we saw the first traction on telco cloud. But I think now as well, what we see moving forward is a focus on this IT and telco convergence. So I think that's another area, and I think in terms of services, then bringing the services, for instance, on top of IMS to market. So I think that's currently indeed what we see as a key starting point moving to the cloud in the operator side.
If I could, Vern, also jump in here, that's exactly correct. But also, we're seeing beyond VoLTE, some other IMS-based services that we're seeing are just things like network slicing, whereby you can take what used to be a monolithic IMS element and slice it into bits for different purposes for different users. So, for example, you might have some machine-to-machine or IoT applications that you could put on top of that. So those would be examples of new services. And there's lots. I mentioned virtual CPE. Lots going on the business side to provide I guess you could call bandwidth on demand type services. So customers can actually do a lot of self-service. The kinds of Ethernet or VPN services that they want to have from their service provider, they can actually go in and kind of update or upgrade those services themselves, and that can all happen via software. So those are some of the services that we're seeing that are driving some of the deployments. And it's new. It's a kind of a variation on services that are available already, but it's a very, very flexible approach to the whole business services market, for example.
Okay, thank you. Sammy, what specific portions of the RAN network, EPC, IMS, will be virtualized in the cloud environment, in your opinion?
I think that discussion is ongoing right now. What would it be? For example, we have in our roadmaps, we have pretty much everything coming to the telco cloud. Some coming sooner, and some are already, and some coming a little bit later. But including the RAN, we see an opportunity in the RAN as well to do some cloud implementation to enhance the RAN deployments.
And following that theme, what about the transport network?
Definitely, there's lots of discussion about the transport network as well, and the software-defined network is the key when implementing telco cloud networks in general. So, yes, I would say definitely it will be part of the implementation.
Okay. And Peter, from your perspective, would the service provider see a savings from Nokia NFV products on standard hardware versus existing products on bare metal?
I think that's what we're seeing now. For instance, if you look at our offering, so everything is moving to commercially off-the-shelf hardware. So I think using VM virtualization, I think that's really a key there that helps bring back the overall TCO, so total cost of ownership. And I think as well on the other side, what was mentioned, some of the benefits that cloud brings in terms of scalability. So you can scale more shorter term and then grow, as the traffic grows. So I think that's another area. So I think definitely there will be benefits, and I think there's benefits we can bring off of providing the Nokia NFV products onto the cloud environment.
Okay, thank you. And Peter, staying with you, please. Does Nokia see an opportunity providing operators orchestration and management NFV offerings? And do we have a solution there for this?
Yes, so I think that this is around orchestration and management. Yes, so we are developing our own orchestration offering. So as part of the let's say the SDNFV, so a service orchestrator and a network orchestrator. So I think for the network orchestrator, we have our own development, network cloud director, and as well then for the service orchestrator, we're partnering with a third party to bring that functionality into play. So yes, we are developing an overall offer, and obviously then on lower levels on the cloud, the NFV manager, So there we have come, so our cloud application manager to automatically deploy then these applications. So absolutely, we're building this into our Etsy NFV architecture.
And Peter, maybe to add that a little bit. So in our cloud network director in the orchestration, we are able to and willing to integrate to operator service fulfillment solutions in case they already have one in the legacy network. And additionally, our product includes the legacy network configuration functionality, so we can orchestrate the whole network, including the legacy part, at the same time automatically.
Okay, thank you guys, both. Peter, for yourself, please. For an IMS core virtualization, what are some of the challenges that have been observed during the integration of the IMS VNF with other network elements, and how has horizontal scaling benefited at this aspect?
Yeah, maybe I can start, and then maybe you can as well, Sami, provide some insights from the let's say in North America in terms of the deployment. So I think indeed, I think the firstly the point is around the deployment itself. So I think we shortened the deployment times and have services around that because we bring it to cloud. So we can shorten the time from deployment to testing to be in service. So this time to market, I think that's a key part. Obviously, over the last 2 years, when cloud came in, it was a quick learning and a steep learning curve to bring this into operation. And I think that's all those let's say challenges and solutions. We incorporated that into our product offering that we have now in IMS on the cloud, but as well from the services perspective. And I think that's maybe Sami from your let's say case examples. Would you have any additional points there to bring in?
Yeah, I fully agree with your statement, Peter. So based on the experience what we have had so far, yeah, the deployment is faster definitely into the lab and into the production network as well with the VNFs. The deployment model so far mostly has been, when the operators have been looking at the deployment, that they would deploy the whole capacity at once. So because of the complexity of the orchestration and the operation issue, when moving to totally new platform and totally new way of thinking things, this provides much of opportunities for new way of thinking, but at the same time there are lots of challenges. So the deployment has been mostly to deploy the whole capacity, and I would say that's the only use case we have so far, that deploying the whole capacity at once and not starting to do the scaling and scale out functionality as of today yet. But that's coming soon, clearly, when the operators learn how to operate the network.
Okay, thank you, Sami. Dana, I think you actually addressed this during the presentation, but it may have been missed. So the question is, if you could repeat the answer, could you provide a little bit more detail on the NFV spend? Is the spend that you talked about on service hardware, services, et cetera? Please.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I did mention that we do split the forecast by hardware, software, services, as well as by NFV, SDN, and cloud computing. And when we zero in on the NFV piece, we do have that split by hardware, software, and services underneath that. So we look at it many different ways. And our forecast right now, if you look at the end of the period, we believe that, as I mentioned, the hardware is actually going to be a pretty significant part of this because they have to get the new servers and the new storage elements in place. So that's the middle. I would call that the middle of the three in terms of size. The software, believe it or not, in our forecast is the lowest of the three hardware, software, services, and that does include VNFs, which will dominate that software spending, as well as the OSS and management spending that I mentioned. So the orchestration software and the NFV management software is the second piece of that, and then you get into things like the virtualization software itself that we were talking about a little bit ago. So the virtual infrastructure management, for example. The services is actually the biggest piece. So we do believe, because this is all new, that there'll be a lot of need for integration services, particularly in the early days here. So when you break down NFV by hardware, software, and services, it's actually the software is the smallest, the hardware is next, and the services is the biggest piece.
Okay, thank you for that clarification, Dana. And I think I have time for one more question. And Sammy, this is to you, please, sir. Can a service provider work with another vendor's software, and how would that original vendor continue to monetize?
So I would say the HCNFV is based on the open interfaces, and our implementation especially is coming from that angle. So definitely the whole idea of the telco cloud network is that we have one infrastructure, one compute networking and storage solution with one hypervisor, and then the vendors will start to deploy their VNFs on top of that common platform. So answer for that question is yes. And how the vendor continues to monetize, so like Dana was explaining, the VNF itself is the smallest revenue generator in the future, so the services will be in bigger portion. They're helping to integrate and verify everything in the network.
Okay. Guys, thanks very much for that and going through the slides. Kyle, I think I'm at the end of the hour, so I'll turn this over to you for closing remarks, please.
All right, thanks, Vern. That is about all the time we have today. Before we go, I want to alert everyone to a new white paper publishing on rcrwireless.com next week. It's by Nokia about cloud transformation, going a little bit more in depth about what we discussed today. It should be a really great paper, and we should have it up there by November 4th. So definitely keep an eye out on rcrwireless.com under the white paper section for that. We will also be sending an email blast out to the entire audience. If you are subscribed, you will receive that email. All right. With that, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, Carrier Cloud Transformation, Profitability, Challenges, and Strategies, presented by Nokia. And again, our presenters today were Dana Cooperson, Research Director at Analysys Mason, Sami Pekala, Telco Cloud Chief Architect at Nokia, and Peter Knickink, Head of Service Product Management for Telco Cloud at Nokia. Thank you, everyone.